Well, good morning and welcome to week 12 of Common Practice. My name is Matt Rustin. I'm the executive director at Made to Flourish. And welcome. This is our regular check-in moment as the Made to Flourish Network, a chance for us to come together as pastors and as leaders in organizations to talk about how we can be shepherding the church in these challenging times. And these are challenging times. I don't think many of us saw 2020 coming at the beginning of the year as you kind of charted out the course of your year. And maybe there's always a lot of things to be worried about in our world, but these past few months have been pretty intense, haven't they? Let me just state the obvious and list a few of the things that we know have happened so we can feel the accumulation of that. First of all, this novel coronavirus that was both infecting people at an alarming rate and killing people at an alarming rate. That's our lives were at risk. Then we had an economic collapse on the heels of large parts of our economy being shut down with no roadmap for the future. That's our money, our sense of security. Almost 40 million people then filed for jobless claims in the past few months. That's our sense of contribution or meaning or our jobs. Then if the coronavirus wasn't enough, these three widely publicized, horrific, brutal killings of African Americans, yet again, after so many stories that have come down through the years. That's our sense of justice being violated. Then the unrest that has ensued in our cities across the country. That's our sense of stability. And oh yeah, we're in an election year with an incredibly divided country. Passion like I can't remember in our lifetime. That's our sense of, I guess, where power lies and that being kind of up in the air. So that's a lot, isn't it? And you mix all of that with a few realities. First of all, for many of us, we've been relationally disconnected from friends and family, at least in an embodied way, for much of the last few months, even though that's beginning to change. And then this thing, I don't know if you've been hearing this term that people have been using, doom scrolling. Doom scrolling. It's this idea that we're on our social media feeds and we're scrolling on the feed and we can't stop ourselves. We have to keep reading negative news. And no matter how hard we try, we can't break away from it. So all that added up, that's a recipe for massive amounts of anxiety in ourselves, in our culture, in people we know. Even for the calm among us. That's a huge challenge. The future is unpredictable. Our world is in upheaval. And the question that I've been thinking about is, what does that kind of anxiety over the course of quite a long time, what does that do to the human soul? And I'm so glad that we're having today's conversation to address that question with our guest. Thrilled to welcome Dr. Curt Thompson, practicing psychiatrist and one of the leading experts in our country on the intersection of interpersonal neurobiology and spiritual formation to talk about that very subject. I guess another way to say it is Dr. Thompson is one of the leading thinkers and practitioners in understanding the connections between our brains, our bodies, our relationships, and our formation in Christ. He's a best-selling author, most recently The Soul of Shame, and previously Anatomy of the Soul. Curt, it's a delight to have you with us today. Could you talk just a little bit about the context of your work and your writing?
Thanks so much. It's just an honor to be with you all. I know that I was supposed to be in Kansas City earlier this year where everything got deleted. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be with you and with your fellow pastors. As I often tell folks, that I don't really believe that anybody does harder work than pastors for a whole host of reasons. And I just want to say at the outset that I'm just really grateful for all of the unending effort that pastors put into their daily lives, where they don't really have many boundaries because everybody just believes that they should have a piece of the pastor whenever and however they want. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this and grateful for what your organization is doing to support the effort of pastors around the world. My work involves largely one of the things that we try to talk about when people ask me what I do is that I think largely we try to help people tell their stories more truly. That's really what we do. And we do that by bringing hopefully integrated and well-researched neuroscience to the table. We do that by understanding that neuroscience, though it's tempting to think that it should hold the authorship for so much in the world, that authorship actually isn't, and the stories that we tell about neuroscience actually is held by the great storyteller, that we also want to understand neuroscience in the context of the biblical narrative. And so we also try to do our work in that context, really believing that wherever the truth is spoken, Jesus shows up and that the Holy Spirit is active. And we've come to, over the last few years, we've come to see that that kind of work most powerfully takes place in the context of groups, most powerfully in the context of communities where people are actually able to live out in a way that their brains were most intended to live out. And I think not least of which being in this particular age of coronavirus and racial upheaval, economic displacement, and so many other hard places, it's been an honor to be able to walk with people in a way that continues to enable them to do the work of making sure that we are not alone, even as we were made to be not alone from the very beginning. So it's great to be with you.
Thanks, Kurt. Look forward to having more conversation in just a little bit. Our conversation today, you saw it, pastoring in an age of anxiety. And this conversation is not only for pastors. We are a pastors network, but many of us on the call today are not pastors, at least in our kind of full-time work. At least we wouldn't call ourselves a pastor. And yet, many of us take on pastoral roles in different areas of our lives. It could be in our company or an organization or a network or even in our families. So this conversation around shepherding, leading ourselves first and leading others, it's for all of us today. What does this age of anxiety mean for all of us in this moment? I want to start today's conversation before we get back to Kurt, just with a poll question. And this is for all of us logging on. Would love to have you participate. 2 simple questions. First of all, in the last few months, I have felt on the whole, more anxious than usual, about the same amount of anxiety as usual, or less anxious as usual. Then the second question, in the last few months, others around me, I know that's a broad question, but others around me, for the most part, seem to have more anxiety than usual, about the same amount of anxiety as usual, or less anxiety as usual. So the results are ticking in. Many of you are kind of registering in your answers, and I'm looking at the answers here, and it says in the last few months, about 80% of you said, I felt more anxious in these last few months than what is normal for me. About 20% said about the same as usual. Only 4% said less anxious. Maybe we need to be talking to you on this call today. In the last few months, and then others around me seem to have more anxiety. 95% of you said that was true. So thank you for weighing in. Just a sense, I think what we all know, what we all are feeling is that kind of anxiety is in the air, and that we're going to be getting to that topic in just a moment. I just wanted to say before we start, though, the primary way that we can interact with you is through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, at the bottom of your Zoom window. So that's the place where we'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and you can send those in at any time during our call. And for about the first 30 minutes, Kurt and I will be kind of talking back and forth. In the last 30 minutes, we want to have some time where we get to your questions. So certainly send those in, and we'll get to those the second half of our call. But Kurt, get us started. It makes sense that a lot of people are feeling anxiety across our country, just in light of all that's going on. But as you look across the country with your kind of expertise, what are some of the root causes of anxiety you're seeing? You wrote a recent blog post on your website talking about our relationship with time and how that is so disrupted. Can you talk just a little bit about that and what you see happening across the country?
Sure. Well, we like to say that I mean, for most folks, if you ask them if they're anxious or worried about something, they're talking about something. We like to say that anxiety is a function of our mind's capacity to think about the future. I think about the future, and then I imagine something that's going to be coming at me from the future, whether it's 5 minutes from now or 5 years from now. And I tend to imagine a particular scenario in the future. that bad things are happening, and the movie doesn't end well. And so I'm worried about these things. And at first glance, we'd say, well, of course, that just makes sense. Now, what's really interesting about all this is that, as it turns out, in terms of what the brain does, the brain is actually far more interested in not just the events that we worry about that may be coming in our future. And so I think about, like, will I have a job, in a month? Will I be able to pay my mortgage? So these are not small things, especially now. These are real things that can be happening with folks. But my brain actually isn't so much generating the feeling, the viscerally, physically felt sense of anxiety in response primarily to this abstract event that I might call unemployment, or the abstract event of having COVID. It's not about an event per se. What my brain is actually paying most attention to is what it anticipates my emotional state will be. It anticipates that I'm going to be afraid, that I'm going to be disconnected. And here's where the biblical narrative is really crucially important for us. There's so much for us to know and understand about the first, 10 chapters of Genesis. And one of the first things that we read in the creation narrative is that it's not good for man to be alone. This is not just some off-the-cuff throwaway comment that the writer happens to offer to us about God's thoughts. This is fundamental to how brains work in society. My most deeply felt anxiety emerges primarily from my worry that I will be evermore cut off from you, that I will be alone. And that sense of being alone is the thing that really fuels the emotional state that then colors my anticipated future. And so it's not just I worry about unemployment. What I'm actually worrying about is the feeling of powerlessness and being without anybody coming to find me, without anybody coming to help, being cut off with no agency to change that emotional state of feeling completely alone. And so this feature of time that you mentioned, right? The feature of time that we're in the middle of, even now with COVID, is important because one of the most important things that we tell people in trying to reduce anxiety is that the more able I am to focus my attention on the present moment, to live where I am, physiologically, I am unable to be anxious if I am living in the present moment. When Peter is about to sink beneath the waves in Matthew's gospel, and Jesus calls out and pulls him in, Peter's problem was not just that he saw the wind and the waves. He's anticipating a future in which things are not going to be good in about 5 minutes. But Jesus says, basically, if you're focusing your attention on me, this isn't happening. And to focus my attention on you right now is to be where I actually am, not off in the future where I'm actually not yet living. This is different, I might say, and it's important to distinguish. To plan for the future is a different neurobiological activity than to ruminate about the future. To worry about the future. Even though I'm ruminating, I'm thinking about the future, or if I'm planning for the trip that I want to make, or planning for retirement, or planning for what might happen if I lose my job. That act of planning is a function that my mind actually has to do right now. The planning is taking place in the present moment. Yes, it's correlated with a future event, but it's an activity that's taking place right now. Worry is me ruminating, but I'm not actively engaged with my world right now in that moment. One of the challenges that the COVID situation has presented us with is not just that there is a pandemic, but as all of our listeners know, it is a pandemic about which we have great difficulty predicting the future. And my difficulty in being able to predict the future with some degree of confidence, when will the next wave come? How long will we have to be spatially distanced? I don't know that. My mind has a very difficult time not being able to know one way or the other when those time frames are going to be. And as such, this just ramps up my anxiety because I keep looking for a future space. I can't find it because I can't see through the fog. And consequently, my anxiety increases, but primarily because I am not remaining in the present moment, connected with others in that same time and space dimension.
That's fascinating, Kurt, because as you're talking, as humans, we can never predict the future, and yet we hold on to maybe the illusion that we basically know what's coming. But in a time like this, when we feel like we're in free fall, there's no illusion that we are out of control, which is maybe the situation that we're always in, but we're just more aware of it now, and we focus on that.
Well, I think it's interesting. Some of your participants in answering your survey, those who said they're less anxious. For instance, one of the things that we've discovered is that with this situation, many people, of course, have had to curtail their life's activities. And what has that meant? That's meant that there are actually a lot of parents who, instead of living in the whirlwind of a life that is completely planned out every minute of every day, where their children's lives are scheduled from here to eternity, they don't have to do that. They're not worrying about getting to soccer practice. They're not worrying about getting to here and there and so forth and so on. And that's a different kind of anxiety. That's an anxiety that comes with, I'm so overpacked in my schedule that I'm afraid that I'm not going to be enough to do all this. And of course, the reason is because you're not enough, and we are overscheduled. And so for many people, this situation has actually put them in a place in which their mind is actually living as it was more intended to live, while at the same time having to, contend with this, the thing that you've pointed out rightly, that as I said in the first essay that I wrote, the virus and the disease are as much revealing reality as revealing our anxiety as it is tending to cause it. Because, we're an anxious people, and we've been anxious since we've been walking the earth. I think what this then means, again, is it raises the question around how able am I to practice daily being in the present moment as far as my own personal life is concerned, but also being connected with people in a way that we were actually more made to be connected, as opposed to moving at the helter-skelter pace that many of our lives are kind of packaged and wrapped in.
Yeah, it makes me think you're talking about these two themes of like staying in the moment, staying today, and then we're not alone. And of course, many of us, our minds are rushing to Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus doesn't just say, don't worry, stop worrying, you worry, you anxious people, but he actually says, don't worry about the future, kind of stay present in today. What tomorrow will worry about itself. Today's got its own worries, focus on the present. And just as many injunctions that, be not afraid, I am with you. I am with you. Mm-hmm. And it's both a call to remember, I guess, God's presence in our lives in this moment, but also it's a reminder that healing comes as we remember that we're not alone with the relationships around us. You talk a lot about the importance about relational connecting and relationships around us. Could you reflect on maybe some of those passages in the scriptures and talk a little bit more about these themes of not being alone?
Right. I think, one of the important things, we talk with patients about this, and we talk with, when I'm speaking about these things, I think it's important that we not forget that we live in a world, and we live that's living against a backdrop, like a historical and cultural and anthropological backdrop of modernity, right? This sense that we should be able to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We should be able, as individuals, we have, this is liberal democracy. We should be able to do I should be able to do what I want and be effective at this. And we've been drinking this Kool-Aid now for close to 350 years, perhaps. And there are elements of that are really, truly beautiful and wonderful. And there are elements of that when taken to extreme, help support the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, which is one in which we practice unintentionally, but we practice isolating ourselves. We practice not being in the present moment. You introduced me to, what did you say, doom scrolling? Is that right? Did I have that right? Right. It's the first I've heard that. It's a beautiful phrase. But let's just acknowledge that doom scrolling was around in our culture, as it turns out. We just didn't know to call it that, like long before COVID ever showed up, right? Because many of us find ourselves on our social media just scrolling. It doesn't feel quite as bad because we weren't in the middle of COVID, but what it's actually doing to our brain is helping me practice being disconnected. It helps me practice being, having difficulty paying attention. It helps me practice distraction. And as I am more easily distracted, I'm not nearly as able to stay present with you over the rhythm and hum of all of the interpersonal interactions that we have to have. So now we have high school students sitting outside the high school, not now, but when we weren't in COVID, sitting outside, talking to each other on text because they don't know how to have interpersonal face-to-face conversations. We are practicing becoming more disconnected in this way. And so when Jesus talks about not being anxious, when St. Paul talks about be anxious for nothing, but instead pray about everything, that's not just an assumed, well, here's this magic talisman. If you just pray about something, all these things will go away. Paul is writing this from an experiential standpoint of one who is steeped in this sense of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one who recognizes that community is everything. In his travels, in his letters, we see how much Paul himself is depending on the well-being and the well wishes and actions of other people. Jesus talking about, it's interesting to me where he says, where two or more of you are gathered, that's where I'll be. He doesn't say, now, I know wherever you go, like, I'll never leave you. But he could have just said, wherever any of you go as individuals in the modern world, I will be with you. Where two or more are gathered, there I will be among you. And this is exactly what our neuroscience would tell us, that my brain is at its most tranquil. And by tranquil, I don't mean asleep. I don't mean, I'm not anesthetized. I mean, I am most alert, I am most attuned, and I am most relaxed simultaneously when I have the felt sense of being deeply connected to two or more others, whether they're in the room with me or whether they are around the globe with me. But what's important about that is that I need to have some capacity for practicing strengthening my imagination by having real contact with real people, whereby which I can also not just be with them in the room, they're looking at me, I'm looking at them, but whereby which I can be deeply known by them, whereby which the parts of me that I both love and that I hate the most, I know are known to you, and I know that you still want to stay in the room, that you have no intention of leaving, despite that we both know what we both know about each other. This work of connecting in this way, when Jesus says in John 12 about and they will know that you're my disciples by the way that you love one another. This is not about they'll look at you and they'll see how nice you are to one another. They'll look at you and they will see that there's nothing about either of you that you don't know and you're not leaving the room. How does anybody do that? We have an entire world that is built on trying to create some kind of illusion that I want to provide for the world to know that I've got all my stuff together. And the reality is that none of us do. And the sooner we have relationships in which we can acknowledge that, the sooner I am able to live in the present moment with you, not worried about how my inadequacy is going to show up tomorrow. Because as long as I'm connected to you, I'm paying a lot more attention to this connection and thereby practicing paying attention to God. Because when I do it with you, it gives me a capacity to have a hard deck on which I can imagine my relationship with God. And when I'm paying attention to that, I'm paying so much less attention to the voice of my shame attendant that wants to be telling me and reminding me over and over again the multiple different numbers of ways in which I just don't have my life together. And
Yeah.
so not only is connection a solution to anxiety, it is also, even more importantly, what we need in order for us to fulfill this calling, this mandate of creating most flourishingly, taking a word from your page, most flourishingly creating even as we were made to create.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Want to just remind people, so much good content there, and be sending in your questions, comments through that Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom window. Curt, I want to, I didn't hear the word come out, but I heard you expressing the idea. You've written a lot about empathy, and a lot of people have written a lot about empathy. It's kind of a new buzzword. But we recently reposted one of your articles on our website that I thought was really lovely on this theme of empathy, and just that when we receive that from someone, we likely don't forget it because it's so significant. It's so rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of these things that the vast majority of us don't do particularly well, that we don't give an empathetic ear. And it's actually a skill that we need to cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
But it's when we experience that empathy that that we're transformed.
Right.
And when we give empathy, we ourselves are transformed. One final comment about that article, and I'd love to hear your comments about that. You made this note that especially in the Psalms, we see the writers expecting a God of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a lovely thought to think that as we are our honest selves, it's not sort of a God like crossing his arms or even listening without emotion. I know I'm getting into trouble with divine impassibility there, but it's the sense that God is attuned, that he has empathy for us. Could you just talk about the role of empathy and how do we both receive that and give that? And
yeah, it's a great question, Matt. A couple of things that jump off the page to me when I think about this. The first thing is that when many people think about empathy, we tend to think of it as like kind of like breathing. Like it's as natural, like you should just be able to do it just like you breathe. It turns out that empathy is something that we learn to do. As we like to say, all intentional human behavior, from my pointing my finger to my opening my arms and coming to embrace you, to the tone of my voice that might either speak to you with joy or with scorn, all intentional human behavior is learned by mimicry. I don't pick it up by myself, I learn it. And as it turns out, empathy is one of those intentional human behaviors. And so I'm not going to know how to be empathic any more than I'm going to know how to read unless somebody else teaches me this, unless I have some kind of mechanism whereby which somebody can inculcate this into me. It can happen one of two ways. It can happen in a way in which I receive it personally, and I have the feeling, as we like to say, of feeling felt by you. I have the sense that I'm being seen by you. This is Hagar in the desert, right? Behold the God who sees me. We can also learn it by actually witnessing it happening between one and another person. I can watch this happen. I see the intentional human behavior, and I can pick it up in that way. But what is most important is that if I don't witness it or I don't experience it personally, it's not going to be something I'm naturally or necessarily easily going to extend to other people. But the beautiful news is, as you've rightly said, if I've grown up in a house where empathy has been hard to find, it's not like, well, I didn't get it when I was a kid, and I guess I'm screwed, right? There's nothing I can do about it. No, I can actually learn and practice how to do this. And the way that I practice how to do this is by being in a relationship in which I experiencing it being extended to me from someone else. Another thing that we like to say about empathy is that we don't ever change our behavior sustainably on behalf of another human being apart from empathic connection to them. I can change my behavior on your behalf for the short run, if you shame me into doing it, if you yell at me into doing it, I'll do it because I'm afraid, I'll do it because I'm ashamed, but it's not sustainable on its own. If I have a felt sense of what your pain is, I'm much more likely then to change my behavior on your behalf in a sustainable way. This is why in our current situation with racism, as you know, our current iteration of this, as we are becoming increasingly attuned to this, it's why yes, it is crucially important for us to look at the structural elements of racism. If we don't, we're going to be in big trouble. It's also just as equally important for us to be practicing, especially those of us who are white, practicing hearing stories, listening to stories, not just about racism in the abstract, but about those stories from real people, real bone and blood people. Because if I do not have an empathic connection to the people who have suffered, it's going to be really difficult for me to sustainably change what I do on behalf of the benefit of the whole. And so those are some important things. And here's the last thing I will say, though, about empathy. And this is kind of an additional thing we really have to pay attention to. Empathy has, I think, rightly made its way onto the stage in a more helpful way in the last decade. I think that's really important for us. But like all good things, as we like to say, evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done. And as such, one of the ways that empathy actually has been hijacked is that we now have kind of come to a point where in some sectors, empathy is to be equated with you do whatever it is that I want you to do. So I don't really feel you feeling me. It's not just about my emotional state, but it's about if I don't get what I want because of what I feel from you, then you're not being empathic. And this is really, this is where we like to say that empathy is, I have this saying there, that empathy has its limits. And in fact, part of the way empathy works requires that we have limits. Here's an example. If I see that you're drowning and I'm the lifeguard, it actually ultimately, I'm going to get in the water because hopefully it's not just my job, but hopefully because like literally I have an empathic connection to your plight. But you know how this works, and the stories are replete with how people can be so panicked when they're drowning that they do all kinds of things that make it really difficult for the lifeguard then to do their job. And so the lifeguard wants to come to them and they overwhelm the lifeguard, and the lifeguard, though he is empathic or she is empathic with the victim, the lifeguard actually also can't only be feeling what the victim is feeling. I can't only be so immersed in what you're feeling that I'm not able also to observe it from behind this and say, I need you to calm down. I need to set a limit with this. I need to have a part of me that is outside of your plight in order for me to actually then be helpful for you. And so empathy is not just about feeling what someone else feels. It's feeling something in addition to that. It's feeling something more than that in order for me then to be able to take proper action on your behalf. If my 10-year-old son is really upset with me because I'm not willing to buy him the baseball glove because we bought him one last year and it's still brand new and he hasn't grown out of it, I can be empathic and say, this is really hard. I really get your disappointment. And we're not going to get you a new glove. Now, he might not like the fact that I'm not going to get him a new glove. But if I'm only going to respond to his heartfelt sadness at not having a new glove and buy him yet a new glove, I do him a disfavor. And so in this way, we're trying to also teach people that part of the empathic response includes our capacity not only to feel what the person is feeling, but also to feel more than what they are feeling in order for us to respond properly to them and ultimately be more helpful than they think that we are being by saying no sometimes.
Yeah, that's really good clarification. Really helpful, Kurt. I want to get to one more, take a slightly different route on this conversation around anxiety, and then we're going to get to questions. I see them coming in. I want to get to as many as possible. But let's turn our attention maybe to organizational concerns that many of our pastors might have, many of our organizational leaders might have. I heard a story, maybe some of our listeners have heard this, that a number of years ago, Tim Keller, ministering in New York City after 9/11 and all the tragedy happened there, he said they were doing 25% more work at their church with 25%, actually double the amount of people with 25% less budget. And everyone kind of, was trying to be tough and they did a great job kind of rising to the occasion. But in the midst of that, Tim calls a friend in Oklahoma City, a pastor there that experienced the Oklahoma City bombings and all the trauma that happened there. Mm-hmm. And the pastor of the church in Oklahoma City said, basically, for the year, even the year and a half after that tragedy, our church was really doing well. And then about 2 years after the tragedy, we had this mass exodus of our pastoral staff that left because finally they'd sort of hit the wall and they crashed and they couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't take it anymore. And I'm just thinking about the people who lead organizations, who are pastors, and right now they're kind of rising to the occasion and all flexing muscles. But what are the long-term implications of sort of this little t trauma that we're going through? What advice would you give to organizational leaders as they're thinking about self-care and all these important themes at this time?
Matt, that's a great question, a great observation. And I love the story that you've just told about Tim Keller and his relationship to the pastor in Oklahoma City. You know, fundamentally, these things are deeply connected to just our normal physiology, as it turns out. So for instance, we human beings are naturally rhythmic people. We are rhythmic in the way that we have cardiovascular rhythms, our heart rate, we have a pulmonary rate. We are in rhythm with a world that turns on its axis every 24 hours, that goes around the sun once a year. We have tides, we have migrations. Like, we are a rhythmically created being. Not only that, but we are rhythmically created to both be in community and then in solitude, and in community and in solitude, just like the systolic movement of the heart and the diastolic relaxation of the heart. In the same way that we are made to work really, really, really hard for 6 days, and then we are called to work differently. We are called to rest. Systole of the heart for 6 days, and then we take a different day. We take 1 day, and we are concentrating very differently. As well in the brain, when the brain is on high alert, high octane output, and under a great deal of stress, when trauma comes, traumatic activities come, I have an elevation in my stress hormones, my ACTH, other stress hormones that come actually to the aid of my brain to help the brain be sustained in that period of stress. But interestingly enough, cortisol, which is my stress hormone that comes to my aid, my brain does pretty well if it sticks around for maybe a week or two. You get beyond that, and the very thing that helps my brain metabolize hard and quickly when needed begins to poison my brain. It actually becomes too much. It's like saying, gosh, if we were overwhelmed by an enemy military force, we want to have the Marines everywhere in our streets. But once that was done, we wouldn't want to have armed gunmen like in Safeway. I don't really want to have that. I don't want that reminding me of things if things aren't okay. And so when we have these kinds of periods where they're high stress induction, we're actually asking our brains, we're actually asking our relationships to like be in systole for a lot longer period of time than they were intended to be. It doesn't get the necessary rhythmic interruption, if you will, of rest. It doesn't get the opportunity to have a letdown in a rhythmic intended way. As a friend of mine and I were commenting back a number of months ago, it's striking the number of deaths by overdose that we hear of high performing artists, movie stars, rock stars, that come often immediately in the wake of some of the most profound performances that they've ever offered. And in similar ways, we're seeing that people are working really, really, really hard. And then when all that stress goes away, what am I left with? My brain drops off the edge in terms of my felt sense of not just tiredness, but utter fatigue. I have all kinds of physiologic responses to the stress kind of like leaving, like a riptide going out. And so what I'm left with then, of course, of course, I've had all this reason to be connected to people in these ways that I'm working with, right, on my staff, because pastors, like the pastors I know, they're working as hard, if not harder than they've ever worked in their life, despite the fact that they're not preaching to real people on Sunday mornings in the pews. You're like, that's just a little strange.
Which by itself is hard work.
Right. The whole thing, everything is elevated. And so as we get back to some kind of normal condition, your body, my body, and my collective body is going to sense the departure of connections in ways that we've actually had to make in order to do this work really, really hard. So if I'm on a SEAL team and I'm with the same group of people on really hard missions, and then suddenly, like, we're just like, I'm honorably discharged and I'm done, and I don't have that kind of connection, it's in the same way that I've been working, and then there's just nothing. And it's not really rest that I get, because I'm going to need more than rest. I'm going to need the infusion of a different kind of care. This is why I think that the houses of healing in Tolkien's series on the Lord of the Rings is such a powerful metaphor. It's a place where people go, and if you ask, well, how long will you be there? And the answer is, I'll be there as long as I need to be. I'll be there as long as I need for someone to come and care for me. And so, practically speaking, what we're saying is that in these times, it is crucially that much more important, while people are really expending themselves in these extraordinary ways, that we take that much more care to be connected about the things that we do feel worn out about. And that if and when, as this time begins to change to the degree that we ever come back to some kind of normality, it's going to be crucially important for people not to assume that just because the stress is over, now everybody will be relieved and they'll be better. In the same way, we then need to be coming back around and really checking in with people to say, I really want you to know that I see you and I see all the hard work that you've done over the last however many months. And I want to continue to be with you, not because like you're doing all these heroic things now, but maybe even because you're not. And in that way, we're going the extra step to connect with people, especially when their brains are going to need it because of all of the pounding that it's been taking over the last several months.
Yeah, that's really good. Kurt, we're going to try to go now to speed round, not speed round. That's a little bit lightning round, but we've got a bunch of questions. I want to get to as many as possible. I want you to continue on this theme of self-care. And one of the things that I found so helpful in your writing, both in your books, but also in a number of blogs that you've written recently, is you offer concrete practices of self-care. Mm-hmm. Take us one step further. You've talked about rest, the kind of the diastolic, systolic rhythms that we need to have. You've also talked about the sort of the practices that we can inhabit in the midst of our work. Talk a little bit about the role of practices in self-care, how pastors, leaders, we can be caring for ourselves in these times.
There are probably, and in the number of these articles that I've written that are on my website, you can find them. There are a list of these that you can read. I think some of the ones that come to mind that are most helpful and easy to do. One of the first things is that our situation has us being less mobile. And one of the things that's important for us to do is to be mobile. And so walks, 5 to 10 minute walks 2 times a day. It both moves our bodies as well as it gives us an anticipated thing that we can do. And like if it's summertime now, which is better, but like if the weather's bad, if it's raining, like gear up and go, right? There's no excuse, get out and move. One of the things that we discover is even people who used to go to an office and sit all day in their office, it turns out that they actually weren't sitting as much as they thought they were. They were getting up and going for water, for lunch, for this, and they're not doing that at home now. And so micro movement is one of the most helpful things that we can do because it also gives our bodies a sense of agency, that I can move and have activity. So movement is one. Another thing is really every day having at least one brief phone call with someone else that you know, in which you are calling them or they're calling you, in which you're asking them or talking about with them a couple of things in particular. One thing is like, tell me something today that's really brought you joy. Another way to talk about this, something that I'm grateful for, but something that's brought me joy today. Now, if I'm not assigned to think about this, I don't necessarily pay attention to things that bring me joy. But if you say to me, Kurt, I want you to call me at least a couple times a week and tell me what's brought you joy in the last 3 days, I'm actually going to pay more attention to that. We become what we pay attention to. And if I'm paying attention to things for which I'm grateful, things that bring me joy, then that actually changes a whole range of physiologic factors within me. But in addition, we're also giving people the assignment to name things for which they are lamenting. Name things for which they feel a loss, and it's real. Our daughter, her wedding that was supposed to happen May 9th, it got canceled. What do you do about that? How do you process that? It's important for us to be able to name our laments as much as we name our joys and the things for which we're grateful. So that's something else that we can do. Some other things that we can also, I think, do is there's some things that we can choose not to do. For instance, we've already mentioned the whole doom scrolling. It's really important that we, not be reading much news. It's not helpful for us. I got to tell you, like, if you need to be informed about the news, whatever you're going to need to know, you'll find out. A second thing is, though, really refrain from scrolling through social media. Refrain from that. You can look at it, glance at it, spend a minute, leave it. And the reason is because that kind of scrolling actually enhances and strengthens our states of anxiety and pessimism in our life because of what's happening in our brain at the time that we're doing that. Another thing that we frequently is really, I think, important is the nature of the conversations that we have about anything in life. Of course, when we have COVID, all those big things that you listed at the top of our time, it's very easy in any conversation. Somebody says, well, how are you doing? And we launch into some conversation about any one of those big ticket items that you talk about. And my invitation is for folks to actually refrain from talking about those things. I have a friend who tells a story of, they were in the grocery store. This was back a couple months ago, and people were standing mindfully, 6 feet apart. And they were in the checkout line. 2 people at the end of the line who were not talking to each other at all began a conversation, quiet at first. But the topic was about whose responsibility is it that we're in this mess? And before you know it, you've got 2 people, because they're 6 feet apart, they have to talk loudly to each other. And so now, of course, everybody's involved in the conversation, whether you want to be part of the conversation or not. But the point is, the very nature of the topic that they were talking about led down a rabbit hole that eventually actually became more debilitating and anxiety provoking. So this notion of movement, this notion of gratitude and lament, this notion of refraining from anxiety provoking kinds of behaviors and conversation. And then the last thing I would say is, we're gradually, moving into space and times where we're, together a little bit more. And this actually, in some respects, creates its own kind of new special wave of anxiety. Back in March, if we all knew that we're all just shut down, we don't like it, but at least we know what the boundaries are. And now we're having to figure this out as we go. And so we are going to have people who are in very different places with this, right? People who are like masks off, hugs around, so forth. And then people who are still not leaving their house. It's going to be tempting for shame and accusation to show up in the middle of these things whenever we find ourselves interacting with people who are different than us. Yeah. And pastors, I'm like, I can't imagine. Like, you've got congregations where you've got half of them want to be back in church, half of them like I'll see it in 2023, right? And like, there's all this distress that gets accumulated. And so it becomes yet another time and space that is really about spiritual formation. What does it mean for us now with this next level of anxiety that's going to hit because I can't get people to agree about where the boundaries are? How do I help? And so the thing that we would say is like, look, it's really important. This gets back to your question about empathy. It's really important for us to be able to articulate on a regular basis that this is hard work. This is really hard to do. And it's not hard because we're pansies or we're weak or we're stupid. It's hard because it's like, well, why is 500 pounds hard to lift off your chest? It's because it's 500 pounds. And it's going to require yet another reminder, regular reminders, that we are the people of God who are called to love one another, who are called to be people of the fruit of the Spirit. And any opportunity that we have to be able to say to each other where that's difficult, but where we also are grateful for and acknowledge, thank you for all the hard work. I know that we've got people in our church who like are having a hard time getting back together, but thank you to you folks who are here, who are being patient with everybody else. And thank you to you folks who are out there who are being patient with the people who are being patient with you, patient with yourselves. And so those, I think, are just some concrete ways that we can practice continuing to create connection and community, reducing our anxiety, and still then kind of making space for helping to answer the question, what's the next new beautiful thing that we're going to make together with God?
Yeah, I love that. A number of questions have come in, Kurt, sort of leaders, either as pastors, or someone mentioned that they lead some accountability groups. They're not a pastor, but are there. How would you sort of counsel leaders to address this in their churches or in their spheres of influence? Some of us might feel sort of paralyzed as pastors or leaders. We know that anxiety is a complex topic. There are neurobiological realities, there's chemistry at play, and we don't want to be trite, but we want to also bring the truth of God's word to bear. And some of the things that you're saying, how would you counsel pastors and leaders to address this in their areas of influence?
I think, Matt, that one of the things that strikes me is that one of the phrases that we like to use that we have taken from my friend Dan Siegel, that we name things to tame things. And the more we actually name what our real experience is in the moment, the less anxious we are, and the more confidence we create counterintuitively in the people in whom we are abiding, with whom we are abiding. So for instance, if we are leaders, and as a leader, I don't know what the next step is to take. When you're with your elders, it's going to be really helpful for everybody for you to just say that. Because everybody in the room is feeling the same thing. And this is the thing. When everybody in the room can look at their leader who says, I'm not really sure what to do. Now, he's not running out of the room, but he's putting words to what his current experience is. And here's the beautiful counterintuitive thing that happens. If I'm leading a group and I say, folks, I'm just having a really hard time here because I got these different interests and I'm trying to be the conductor of, players who want to play different pieces of music here. This is where empathy starts to speak, because everybody else is going to be having these same feelings. And when we name this, people around me don't feel like they're by themselves. And I don't feel like I'm by myself. And the moment that I have a sense that I'm not by myself, I am much more clear about the next decision that I have to make. And the next decision that I make, let's be just clear, pastors are making decisions all the time now in which they're not going to please everybody. Somebody's going to be upset. Somebody's not going to be happy. I was having a conversation in a leadership conference a few weeks ago, and this very question came up from a pastor who's pastoring a congregation whose members come from a spread out area over like 3 or 4 different counties. And these different counties are being they have different thresholds of when people can go back to work, and they're not all doing the same thing. And so you get different people who can come to church, other people who can't come to church, all in the same congregation. And we talked about the importance of naming how A, this is hard to do, B, paying special attention to and acknowledging for those folks who, for instance, can't come or aren't comfortable able to say, I really see you. I see how hard this is. And you need to know that just because you're choosing not to come, you're not now less than who we are. You acknowledging for those folks who are coming, this is hard to do. when I am naming the things that I am distressed about in a context of a community that is with me in this, I actually create more confidence by naming my vulnerability. Because in so doing, my brain is not alone. Their brains are not alone. And the moment that I am not alone, I can do anything. We like to say that the brain can do a lot of hard work for a long, long time, as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. This is why Trinitarian theology is such a big freaking deal. This whole sense that Good Friday could only have happened if there is a community who's enabling Jesus to do this. If Jesus isn't doing this in a community, he's not going to be doing it by himself.
Yeah, yeah.
And in the same way, our leaders, and this is the other thing too, you know, we can't give what we don't have. And so to the leaders, I would also be asking this question: who are the people to whom you are going to be refreshed? Who are the people to whom you are going who, when you say, I'm just so done, are going to say to you, I completely get it. I completely get it. Tell me more. I'm not leaving the room.
So good. Yeah. Yeah. Love that. Love those thoughts.
I think there's one last thing I just want to say about this. You know, if there are leaders who are part of, you know, your organization, these are not people who probably need like a ton of extra information, right? These are people who are working hard. These are people who have information at their disposal. What we often don't need, we might need more information, but what we mostly need is courage. And courage does not come just because I have more information. It comes because I'm more connected. And I'm especially more connected in the very places of my heart where I feel most vulnerable, most ashamed, most unlike a leader. And it's in those places where I would long for our leaders to know that somebody is coming to find them, just as the Father comes to find Jesus, just as the Spirit comes to find us.
Yeah.
In order for us to be for others who we're called to be.
Yeah, that's really good. So many good questions, and maybe we can get to a few more here. Just move quickly. The question comes from Peter. What resources would you recommend for families of young kids who might be struggling with anxiety to help children in this environment? Many of them are disconnected from their friends, and life is disrupted. So how do you think about families in this topic?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, it's really tricky because, you know, it's like we are a people who like to think, oh, we have COVID, but we're pretty, you know, we're people of ingenuity. We'll just find a way to like figure it out, and we'll have our normal life despite the fact that we have a pandemic. And there are just certain things that, you know, certain things just don't happen. They don't just get back to normal. And one of those things has to do with like how family lives have changed dramatically in the last 3 months. And so, first of all, to those parents, I just want to say, like, it's really hard. It is really hard. One of the things that I've witnessed, that I've seen that some families have done, is that they're like, look, we're going to find one or two other families with whom we're going to bubble, right? With whom we are going to connect. And it's an important way for us to like, we're just going to call somebody and say, like, can we connect with you? And so that's an important element of this. I know it doesn't solve all the problems. Another thing that I would say is that it's really important in developmentally appropriate ways for parents to actually be curious about what their kids are feeling, allow kids to do the very same things in developmental ways that we're talking about here, that we want ourselves as adults to do. I would say that from a reading standpoint, if parents aren't familiar with it, there's a lovely book called The Whole Brain Child, written by my friend Dan Siegel. You may be familiar with this. And what's really great about this book is that it really does a lovely job of giving parents a helpful way of understanding child brain development. Now, Dan doesn't speak to life in a pandemic, but the fundamental elements that we need to be operationalizing in regular life are the same ones that we operationalize in the life of a pandemic. And at the end of the day, kids, what they mostly need are parents who themselves are at ease, right? In some respects, you know, kids might be anxious, but kids are anxious largely because of what they're reading coming from their adults.
Mhm.
Not just what, I mean, the kids aren't, like my 6-year-old isn't like watching CNN. Well, at least I hope they aren't. So the point being that it's as much going to be about the question of what am I as the adult in the house doing to make sure that my story is well regulated in order for me then to be an agent that can help my child do the very same thing by being with them and asking them the kinds of questions that I also need someone to be with me and asking me questions about.
Yeah, yeah, so good. Kurt, I have the feeling that this could have been a 2 or 3 hour conversation, and you're a wealth of experience and knowledge, and just this is such a felt need right now. It always is, but especially in our moment in culture and in time right now. So thank you so much for your perspective and your wise counsel, and a lot to chew on today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions that were coming in. There's so much interest in this topic. We'll look for ways to have articles or different ways that we can address the questions that you sent in the weeks to come. As always, just want to say that if you haven't connected with Made to Flourish previously, go on our website, madetoflourish.org, and by clicking on the Start Here button, filling out that form. If you've never done that, we'd love to send you a box of resources, absolutely for free, no catch. We'd love to stay connected with you and let you know about further opportunities to connect. Been a joy to be with you during this time, and take care. We'll see you next week.